So our next speaker to welcome to the stage is the fantastic Jeff Townsend. I'm going to spotlight Jeff and then I will spotlight myself as well, because we're going to have a little bit of a chat, aren't we, Jeff? Which is very, very well prepared. In fact, we've just been discussing it now in the chat. But Jeff, we've known one another for a good few years now. And I guess we met after you had set up the Critical Minerals Association here in the UK, along with Kirsty, who we heard from this morning. And we're going to talk a little bit about Critical Minerals Association, but also other things that you've been up to as well. But your starter question, which you asked me to ask you, actually builds on what we've been discussing in part this afternoon. And that is, from your perspective, Jeff, and maybe you want to introduce yourself a bit more and explain to everybody who you are. But through your eyes, what do you actually think is meant by strategic value? But Jeff, over to you.
Hola, ¿cómo estás? That's about as far as I can go with that. Thank you ever so much, and thank you very much for having me here on the Responsible Raw Materials. So I'm Jeff Townsend. I'm the founder of the Critical Minerals Association and a number of other associations. Prior to that, I did about 20 years in politics. So I was born on a mine, grew up in mining communities, and then I worked in foreign affairs advisory stuff with governments around the world, starting in Southern Africa, Washington, DC, and finally back in the UK. When we were designing the title, we came up with building strategic value. And the reason for that is, as part of the CMA and part of the consultancy work I do, I get asked a lot about, can we approach the government for funding? Why does the government, why is the government not listening to us? And it's because the strategic value to the government is not the same as the strategic value to the company. So I kind of break it down into three, almost into a triangle. If we got too clever about this, we could have a dodecahedron. But let's just start with a triangle. And we've got social value, commercial value, strategic value. So I might offend a few people. But do we need all the gold mines and to be bringing all the gold to market that we currently are? Is there a strategic value in that, into building net zero, into defense, etc.? Probably not. However, if they're providing jobs and they're providing good ESG impact locally, then perhaps actually there is a strategic value. Perhaps there is a value to those mines, to the local community that we don't see as Western political players, but local value is there. So it's in the eye of the beholder. And really, where I see a big discrepancy now is that governments recognize that their ideas from 3 years ago, we need critical mineral supply chains, are very different to, well, actually, this is the strategic requirement I have, and actually I'm going to be more strategic in the way that I deploy my resources. You look at America, yes, IRA's got all the headlines, but actually in terms of making things move and making things easier to do, if you can get a DoD, a defense application in there, it's a hell of a lot easier because there's strategic value. Where that flips on its head is sometimes you see the government saying, well, we expect investors to develop this because of market forces. Well, there is a gap between commercial value and strategic value. That gap will never be filled by investors. That's not their job. They'll invest up to the commercial value. They will never invest above and beyond that. That's not their job. That's not going to get their investors any money, or their shareholders any money. And yet governments sit there and go, well, we need this. We need this project for delivery of net zero. Well, fine, then the government has to fund that gap. That's the reality. So I kind of just sit there and I think, well, we have to build that gap in somehow. For me, there are lots of reasons why we are struggling to deliver critical minerals at a time when we should absolutely be flying. But for me, that's a big part of it.
And so, Jeff, just to make sure that we're on the same page here, when we're defining that strategic value, is that strategic value meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, achieving the energy transition in the manner in which we desire. Is that what we mean by strategic value, or am I misunderstanding through the
Thing
eyes
is,
of the government?
well, again, I think it's different for different people. So, um, the UK government, when it talks about critical minerals, it is all based around achieving net zero or fighting climate change. Um, when the US talks about it, there's a lot more of a defense angle to it, and their strategic value is there. And as individuals, or if I own a mine, my strategic value is to get that mine to be operating, because that's when I start making money, hopefully. So I think it's different for everyone, but yeah, generally in the West, and when it was first created around 3 years ago, when everyone started talking about this in more with more gusto, it was all about net zero. It was all around net zero. I think that is shifting, and I think that's why we're seeing governments acting in a different way. Equally, this year we have 52% of the world in elections. So I assume critical minerals will actually fall away, because talking about minerals and mining strategically during elections is not necessarily a vote winner. So the strategic value of talking about critical minerals slightly dissipates over the next 6 months, unless I can continue to talk and annoy governments into accepting they have to do it.
So before we talk about the future, Jeff, let's talk about the recent past. And so when you set up the CMA with Kirsty in the UK back in 2020, and I seem to remember, not that I was invited, but we'll put that to one side. You had a launch event in the Houses of Parliament just before COVID properly took hold in this country. And I think that this was something here where actually for the first time in maybe 40 years, people actually started to use that word mining in UK government, because of course historically that is something where there were big strikes, etc., that happened in the 1980s. So from a political perspective, if you're a politician, talking about mining maybe wasn't all that savvy. How did you manage to get the, I guess, the momentum and the buy-in to even set up the Critical Minerals Association here in the UK, when it came from that base of people not even wanting to acknowledge that mining is a thing?
Uh, Sheer bloody mindedness, mostly. So I started talking to the government about critical minerals in 2013, 2014. And for a long time, there was just, we don't need to talk about this at all. In 2015, I'm telling the government, you're going to have a problem with China. They're like, well, why? We're in the golden relationship. You're misreading the room. I'm like, no, you're misreading what's going to happen in the next 10 years, and this is why. So they went away, and the government spoke to a couple of automotive companies, and they spoke to a couple of the big major mining companies. They came back to me and they said, no, Jeff, you're wrong. We've spoken to these companies, and they say there is no problem whatsoever. And I turned around and I said, well, okay, why would an automotive company tell you it's got a problem with its supply chain? Because if that gets out and governments are leaky, then share prices drop. So you're not going to do that if they knew in the first place. And number two, the majors weren't involved in critical minerals at the time. Critical minerals still to this day is predominantly junior companies or up to mid cap. So we felt we had to give industry a voice, and we felt like the industry cares, very smart people, but there is a different language used between politicians and the industry. So we created an association to give these smaller players the same voice that a Rio Tinto or an Anglo American would have, just by having sheer numbers. I'm very lucky. I knew a lot of the players in the political sphere in the UK, but also around the world, just from decades of doing stuff in that space. So and being born in the mines and growing up in the mines, I absolutely love the mining sector. It is what makes me me. So I felt like I was in a unique position at the time where I could listen and bring the industry along, because I to an extent am seen as one of them, but equally I can go into Parliament and I can be seen as one of them as well. And there was that trust, and we built that bridge on trust, and that still exists, which is great. Just shy of 50 or maybe 50 members now in the UK, but CMA Australia, CMA USA, C2M2A over in Canada, all brought together through the Critical Minerals International Alliance. We got all the acronyms. It's what we do. So I think, really it was, timing was good. Knowledge of who the players are and how Parliament works and the language used, but equally the industry recognizing that, yes, okay, here's someone who can do that and has a desire to do it. And I was very lucky that, so Kirsty and I worked for the same company, and I said to Kirsty, look, I'm going to do this. Do you want to come along and help? Which is brilliant because I can do the high level stuff. Kirsty could organize an empty desk. She's just got an incredible ability to make high level thoughts into actionable stuff, which is absolutely needed. So we were perfect alignment there. So yeah, it was a jump of faith, but it worked, and I think it worked because we delivered quite a lot during those first 2 years. And people saw a lot of movement, which was great. And, we have the buy-in now. There was a debate in Parliament last week, and the minister, the shadow minister, 2 MPs all mentioned that they listen to the Critical Minerals Association as where they get their information from. So, all sides, let's keep on doing the hard work.
Excellent. Well, congratulations, Jeff, on what you've managed to build there, especially that I think that bridge between these different groups who, previous to what you've set up, perhaps had no idea on how to communicate with one another or to reach out and try and build things together. Now, we've had a lot of discussion this week already about different strategic plans or critical raw materials acts, etc. And there are some that are perhaps better, some that could maybe do with some improvements around the world in terms of where we're moving towards. But this space, it is moving so quickly, and there's a huge number of people involved, perhaps especially from the governance perspective and government, who are totally new to the world of minerals, raw materials, mining, the circular economy, all of that. How do you see that evolving at the moment in terms of the awareness of what is actually important, and then people being put in the position of having to make critical choices who, to be brutally honest, don't really know what they're talking about?
Right. In terms of not knowing what they're talking about, that's on us. That's our job as an industry and as the CMA and others, is to provide that information, that understanding. Satala, you guys have given educational courses to 100+ civil servants. So, there is work ongoing in there. I always harken back to Knox Darcy. So Knox Darcy was a Queensland mining magnate, sold everything. He said there's oil in Iran, and everyone went, no, you're mad. He almost bankrupted himself looking for oil in Iran. Went to the UK government. They said, no, what do we need it for? Eventually, 2 weeks before he went bankrupt, he struck oil. And he struck so much oil that he was laughing, and suddenly everyone needed oil, everyone wanted oil. The UK government then basically turned it into British Petroleum. Why is that important? Oil has dominated in the industrial space for the last 100 years. But talking about strategic benefit, UK warships in the First World War used oil instead of coal, and actually gave them faster turning speeds and faster maneuverability. So it gave us a strategic benefit in battle as well. And that's all because one guy decided, well, now I'm going to do this against the advice of all the governments. So my point is, it's upon us to drive that, because governments move slowly. Their strategic value is different to ours. I'd like to see a mine built somewhere, run properly, local communities benefit. Multiplier effect is awesome. Infrastructure built around that. I see the developmental benefit to that as much as I do the commercial value to that. But if that offtake is not coming to the UK or to another, other whatever nation it may be, they would see no strategic value in that. And that's where we need to. There's always going to be a difference. It's how do you align the two?
So bringing that strategic value and that commercial value, and perhaps in that commercial space, or getting the finance to the right point. I mean, there are lots of people here dialed into this session who have got phenomenal projects, etc. But can they get the investors to go, yes, I will come with you on this journey? Is there anything developing at the moment, Jeff, that's a bit more coming from the government side, trying to align some of that financing that is needed to unlock some of that strategic potential? Are you aware of anything in that space?
So there's a lot of finance out there from governments as long as you meet their strategic requirements. Where there is a massive or lack of finance is in the exploration stage. And governments are reluctant to put money in there to the levels that are required to get them up to operation, because the risk is high, the jurisdictions are difficult, etc., etc. I was asked by the Department of Energy in the States to bring together finance and find an innovative way to finance these problems. We put a whole bunch of people from finance together, and they came up with all the solutions that currently exist, because why wouldn't you? They exist for a good reason. And they weren't going to solve the problem. And then I came up with a slightly bonkers idea. I just felt like I had to respond to the DOE. I felt if I didn't, I'd get in trouble. So I put this bonkers idea on the table, and they loved it. They were like, "This is crazy, but we can't see a flaw in it. So we'd like to deliver it." The UK government has said that they would like it delivered, and the Aussies have said they would like it delivered as well. So starting to grow into an MSP solution for this first stage. And the reality is, if we're going to meet net zero, it's that exploration stage that we need to solve, because some say it's 12 years from exploration to bankable feasibility. Some say 17 years. Either way, all of that is far too long. So we need to get that exploration. If we're going to get minerals or materials into the market quickly enough to build renewable energy, etc., to fight net zero climate change. And I still hold hope that we can do that, although, I might be one of the few ones who haven't quite given up on 2050 yet. Then we need to shorten that bridge, which means we need to finance, because I don't believe that it's down to the length of time it takes to do a bankable feasibility. It's down to how quickly you can finance a bankable feasibility. And if we can shorten that time, then that is the way that we are going to do this. And if we can do that, and we can build it alongside world-class ESG, then when it gets to institutional investors, what we're doing is we're handing over a ready-made project, world-class ESG, shortened time, backing of major governments, if not in cash, at least in word. And that's kind of where we sit at the moment. So we've got a call on Friday, and maybe Q3 we'll start to see this new vehicle take shape and start to deliver in that space.
Fantastic. Well, Jeff, let's hope that this new endeavor where you've actually decided to go, hang on, let's step up and put a model of some sort on the table that we can explore, is going to be as rewarding as that gentleman who decided, no, he was still going to continue to look for those rocks in Iran, or whatever analogy you want to make. One final question for you, Jeff, and it just comes back to the world of elections, not least, of course, because many of us will be going to the polling stations here in the UK tomorrow for the local elections. At some point in time, there will be a general election. We'll see when that comes. But there was a question from Murray earlier on, and he asked, can you think of any jurisdiction in the world where actually people would talk about mining to win that strategic value within an election?
Australia, Canada, straight off the bat. So certainly in those two jurisdictions, if you use the right narrative, they're winners. And it may not be at a federal level, it may be at a state level. But they're there. South Africa, again, flip it on its head, but there's definitely a narrative there. It may not be positive. But actually, you start to see a big disconnect in this. So places like the UK and the EU, when it gets to this kind of stuff, you just stick your head below the parapet and ride it out. Australia, if you get it right, this is a big driver for the economy. They'll do it, and sadly, I see it too often in, well, where my original work was in Africa. As soon as you get into trouble, start talking about nationalizing. Um, Whether you do or you don't, you start that dialogue, and that usually helps you along in the polls.
Brilliant. Well, with that, Jeff, and that advice to our lovely politicians for when the time comes for various elections, thank you so much, Jeff. I've lost track of the questions and the chat that is going on alongside all of this, but it's brilliant. I'm sure that Jeff will be able to answer some more of your questions. Everyone, please put your hands together for the fantastic Jeff Townsend. Thank you very much. Awesome. Thanks, Jeff.